Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Friday, July 11th, 2025, and today we are going to be talking about the 2026 Texas Senate race. A contentious Republican primary gearing up to be a very hotly contested battle between incumbent Senator John Cornyn and Attorney General Ken Paxton, with recent news developing out of the Lone Star State yesterday evening. Senator Angela Paxton, senator referring to a state Senate district in the state of Texas, the last name also no coincidence, announced yesterday that after 38 years of marriage, she filed for divorce from Attorney General Ken Paxton on biblical grounds. Now, this is a pretty big piece of the story that's going into a, like I said, contested 2026 Senate primary. A lot of things were going in the direction very positively for Ken Paxton, but last night's news really puts a halt to all of that, as this, quote, mega drama really is hitting the Texas Senate race to a degree that nobody could have expected. Ken Paxton, who has really floated this challenge to John Cornyn for quite some time, announced that he was running for the U.S. Senate not too recently ago. But what we saw was that in that decision, Ken Paxton became the target, not just of Democrats and independents who don't like Ken Paxton and his leadership, but also Republicans that were afraid that Paxton could ultimately drag down the top of the ticket in the 2026 midterm elections. And for a while, there wasn't really much that the National Republican Party could do. The NRSC, the wing of the Senate Republicans that endorses incumbents for re-election, not just in generals, but also and especially in primary elections, had been very adversarial to Ken Paxton, knowing that he was challenging one of their own incumbents in the U.S. Senate. But that endorsement really wasn't weighing anybody down. Ken Paxton was certainly going to be looked more favorably by the average Texas Republican simply because he was more MAGA. He was more aligned with Donald Trump and painted out John Cornyn to be what Donald Trump referred to him in the past as a rhino, Republican in name only. And so despite the National Republican Party's discontent with Ken Paxton, it didn't really seem like much was going to shake up the race, at least not until last evening, which this is a pretty big deal. Angela Paxton, who was also serving in the state Senate during the time that the Texas Republicans impeached Ken Paxton in the House of Representatives, to which it went to the Texas Senate, where she had to make statements and really navigate a very complex process with her husband and his innocence on the line, voting yes or no to convict. These were things that she had to evaluate, has been through it, arguably, the thick and thin with Ken Paxton, and now is deciding to leave and saying that she does not believe that it honors God or is loving to herself, her children, or Ken Paxton himself to remain in the marriage. And so it's not exactly clear what has happened. Very obviously, a lot of speculation, and the purpose of this channel is not to spread gossip. But I do believe that especially within a Republican primary, voters often do evaluate moral character and moral judgment, and especially in a state like Texas that has a very high Christian population that cares very deeply too. In the GOP primary, you can see it, traditional family values. Divorce is not one of those traditional family values. And to the extent as what is released to the press, what comes out about Ken Paxton as the primary is about a year away, there is so much that could be damaging to Ken Paxton should it decide to be released in the future or in the immediate. We don't know. But it is noteworthy in its own right that Ken Paxton's wife is choosing to leave him, and the NRSC is leaving absolutely no stone unturned when it comes down to really trying to hammer this into voters. The spokesperson for the NRSC, again, remember, that's the National Republican Senatorial Committee, so this is an official faction of the GOP, said, quote, "What Ken Paxton has put his family through is truly repulsive and disgusting. No one should have to endure what Angela Paxton has, and we pray for her as she chooses to stand up for herself and her family during this difficult time." And so the 2026 Senate race, as if it wasn't going to be messy enough, looking at who was running, looking at what was going to be discussed, how Donald Trump's involvement was going to change the dynamics of this race. Ken Paxton, who has received some endorsements from members of the Texas House delegation, John Cornyn, who received endorsements from all the other members of the U.S. Senate that are aligned with him ideologically wise, also Ted Cruz announcing that he wasn't going to endorse anyone, and recent polling showing that Ken Paxton was within striking distance of defeating John Cornyn. Now, if it ends up below 50%, on both sides you head to a runoff, coalitions can be built. But Ken Paxton, in the most recent June poll, just administered 3 weeks ago, showed him with a deafening lead. No chance of a runoff if you're losing by 18 points in a head-to-head race like John Cornyn was in this poll. And so it wasn't even just a while back. Ken Paxton has been floating this potential bid for Senate in 2026 for a very long time, polling dating all the way back to 2022, asking voters, who would you prefer, Ken Paxton, John Cornyn? Voters chose Paxton then by 20 points, most recently by 19. And so if it took 3 years to really just narrow down Paxton's lead by a point on the net, not much really was changing about this Texas Senate race, at least, again, not until last evening. And so a big question that will be raised for Ken Paxton and his campaign is, does this news make him drop out? Is Angela Paxton, in a way, shielding information that would be so detrimental not just to Ken Paxton on a Senate bid, but his incumbent office as the present-day Attorney General? Is it more advantageous for him to deal with the divorce privately, take a step back from the mainstream politics, leave his office as Attorney General, or ride out the term, rather than decide to run? And this arguably has been a gift to the national GOP, because it makes John Cornyn that much more likely to win the Republican nomination for Senate in Texas. And Ken Paxton was and continues to be the weakest candidate even before this news for the 2026 race. Texas has surprised us before. In 2018, Ted Cruz defeated Beto O'Rourke by just 2.6% across the state. 2.6%. This is a state that George W. Bush won by 23 points, that Mitt Romney won by 17 points, that even Trump himself in 2016 won by 9. So Beto O'Rourke coming within about 2.5 points of victory in Texas really alarmed the GOP. And Ken Paxton doesn't give them that much less to worry about. In 2022, the Attorney General's race in Texas went to Ken Paxton by a margin of roughly 10 points. But the problem here was that on the same ballot, on the same bid, Greg Abbott outperformed Ken Paxton by roughly a point. And while that doesn't seem like much, 2022 was a much more beneficial year to the national GOP, to Greg Abbott, to Texas Republicans than 2020 or 2018, or arguably even 2016. And that's because Republicans had won back the national popular vote for the first time since the 2014 midterm elections. But even then, Ken Paxton is underperforming Greg Abbott. That means there were voters out there that turned away Beto O'Rourke, but were willing to vote for the Attorney General Democrat because she was the alternative to Paxton. And this was before he was impeached by the Texas GOP. 2/3 of the members on the Republican side of the Texas House of Representatives voted to impeach Ken Paxton, and he almost was removed from office. But the Texas Senate could not get across that finish line. Donald Trump involved himself, defended Ken Paxton, and the votes went accordingly. Only 2 Republicans in the Texas Senate voted to impeach Ken Paxton. And so it is interesting. At baseline, regardless though, this decision for Ken Paxton in 22 to run, then underperform, then get impeached, then to decide to run for U.S. Senate really terrified Republicans in a way that John Cornyn didn't. Even though John Cornyn might be weaker in the primary, he's a much better general election candidate. In 2020, we saw that the state of Texas went to Donald Trump by 5.6%. That's okay, not great. It was definitely a warning sign for the GOP, but what was more impressive for them was that John Cornyn in 2020 was able to win by roughly 10 points. Donald Trump won by 5.6, and here was John Cornyn winning by 9.6, meaning there were hundreds of thousands of voters out there that said, I'm voting for Joe Biden, that voted for John Cornyn in the Senate election. And that matters. That makes a huge difference. MJ Hager had 4.8 million votes. Joe Biden, 5.2, nearly 5.3 million. A lot of crossover support in favor of John Cornyn. And might I add, too, that on the margins, a simple overperformance is a significant improvement than a slight underperformance. And Ken Paxton, after impeachment, after this scandal last evening, will not just slightly underperform. There's a real chance that he could lose if the odds are stacked against him. Because Ken Paxton is not Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz wasn't popular, but he also wasn't Ken Paxton. He was not impeached by the Texas delegation. His wife did not leave him over whatever different reasons that have yet to come out. And Republican primary voters now have a year to reflect on what we are now seeing to make that decision. But it throws the entire state in disarray as the frontrunner now has one of the biggest scandals coming out against them amongst a constituency that absolutely cares about things like this, at least in a GOP primary in Texas. Maybe not nationally, maybe not in every state, but certainly in this one. And so it'll be interesting. Paxton might use this as an opportunity to really shape his image in a way that might be not more advantageous, but more mainstream with what we've seen with candidates who have taken on this MAGA type of background before. Even similarly to Donald Trump. when his current family members, people like Mary Trump, who speak out against him, he disavows them, and he says they're part of this left-wing conspiracy that's all stacked up against me. It's the DOJ, it's Biden, it's Hillary, it's the media, it's Kamala, whatever it might be. These are ways that Donald Trump has really reshaped all of these different negative stories to largely be a wash in the eyes of the American public. Now, with Ken Paxton, I don't think that he's this masterful to any degree. I think there's a reason why he consistently underperforms. But there is a reality which Paxton stays in the race and shapes this out to be, as my wife was paid off by the left, or whatever it might be, and entirely as disrespectful as it would be to Senator Angela Paxton, there's a non-zero chance that that is the outcome. There's another reality, too, two different realities beyond those, where Paxton drops out of the race, John Cornyn wins, or Wesley Hunt decides to run, and you have about two different normal candidates who could run. Wesley Hunt would probably be a little bit easier than John Cornyn. Either way, you're not going to lose the Senate race. With Ken Paxton, again, non-zero chance that you lose it. The other reality is that he rides it out, sees what happens, he drops in the polls, and then has a year to build back up. Because this is a year out from the primary, too. While it gives a lot of voters time to think about things, it gives Ken Paxton time to rewrite the narrative over the next year. Because he's at a 20-point advantage right now. A 20-point advantage that maintained through the test of time of 2022, 2023, 2024, now 2025. He needs one more year to make it a reality, and it very well could come through. And depending on what happens with the Donald Trump endorsement, I don't think we get to a reality unless it's dire enough that Donald Trump even considers endorsing John Cornyn. But it could be in the back of his head as a means to end the Ken Paxton run for Senate. Because Donald Trump has exerted this influence before in ways that have arguably been very strong for the GOP. In most cases, he's been off about it. But in one particular instance, I thought it was very strong. The way that Donald Trump pretty much plucked a random congressman that nobody knew that was polling at 3% across the state and decided, you're going to be the next senator. And it worked. Ted Budd, who was running against former governor Pat McCrory, he had been mayor of Charlotte. He ran for governor, won in 2012, lost re-election in 2016. But Pat McCrory, while not getting that many endorsements, received the endorsement from Senator Richard Burr, whose seat was vacating this one. And what you found, too, was that in the polling, it was Pat McCrory who maintained the advantage. But when Donald Trump's endorsement came in, it really locked things in. Forget Mark Walker, who was one of Donald Trump's first allies. We saw a lot of betrayal on the side of Mark Walker, who thought he would get the Trump endorsement. Pat McCrory, who also had been pretty positive towards the president at the time, the former president, now the incumbent president, did not receive the endorsement. Why? Because members of the NRSC came to Trump and said, there is no shot that Pat McCrory is winning this general election to the degree that we need to win this general election. There was worry amok when it came down to who would be good to run against Cheri Beasley, who had honestly put up a very good showing in the 2020 Supreme Court race in North Carolina. But again, reminding of where we were, Emerson College ran the same polls, May 7th through May 9th, 2022. They had Ted Budd defeating Cheri Beasley 48-41. But amongst the same groups of voters, Cheri Beasley defeated Pat McCrory by 5 points. That is a 14-point difference in performance with just one Republican candidate. While we aren't seeing a 14-point difference in performance between Cornyn and Paxton, we could very well see it start to expand as this scandal runs around, as Democrats start messaging on it, and as Republicans start to lose faith and confidence in their Republican frontrunner. And while I still think this primary could go to Ken Paxton under the right circumstances, it has gotten a lot harder. And by consequence, if he ends up being the nominee, the general election becomes that much harder. It was going to be easier, and it's still going to be, pretty strong for Republicans regardless of what happens. It's still a very hard state for Democrats to crack, and they have not in a very, very long time. Only once in the 21st century have they won statewide. Once, right? And that was an extreme case. And so thinking about where we're at in 2026, we're not there yet. But if Paxton starts to snowball and yet somehow still wins the Republican primary, that's great news for Democrats. On the flip side, the fact that this has happened so early on, chances are that Ken Paxton's odds at winning the nomination have decreased. Voters are going to be less likely to vote for somebody that they don't think can win a general election or they just morally disagree with at foundation. And that could be Ken Paxton. And so I'd keep an eye on the Texas Senate race. A lot is breaking through. Axios put it perfectly when calling it mega drama, because that's exactly what it is. And it will be a very fascinating race to watch because arguably Texas should be in a position that Republicans should have a very easy victory. In 2024, Donald Trump won Texas by 14 points. But now, Republicans might not win it at all. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens with Ken Paxton, some very big news out of the Lone Star State, and we'll see how it impacts this hotly contested Republican primary. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the top left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video for you to watch, and then a playlist for my 2026 Senate election analysis videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all later today.